What's going on, everybody? So, new video on the Toyota camper. This one, no updates, but it's an issue that I had to address. It was an electrical issue. I've had a periodic light flashing on my dash, and it's known as the charge light. Now, every Toyota from 84 to 91 will have this similar setup like this, and I'll show you inside. Long story short, I had to trace it down, and so I figured I'd do a video to make it a little bit easier to trace down that issue, or give you some insight of what potential issues it could be for a charging system issue on a 22R or 22RE. So I'll show you what essentially the issue was. Now, on the charge light, I got this. I had a charge and a brake light flashing at the same time. It would go on, off, and then inevitably, in the period of 2 months, it just stayed on one day. In fact, I was on my way up to Wyoming, Devil's Tower, Wyoming, and literally in the middle of nowhere, this light just comes on, it stays on. So that's telling you that there is a charge issue. There's a sensor that's sensing either an overcharge or an undercharge. I automatically assumed that it was an undercharge issue. Figured, okay, maybe it's loose battery connections, check those. Could be a loose alternator connection or a voltage regulator. Well, long story short, it turns out it was the voltage regulator that had failed. Well, I went through the process of changing out the alternator because everybody on the forum suggested that immediately it's the alternator, change it immediately. It's never the voltage regulator. Well, that was false. It was actually the voltage regulator. So I have a fresh alternator in here and I have a fresh voltage regulator, and that inevitably fixed the issue. But I'm going to show you under the hood of what to look for, what to test for, and so you're not stuck replacing one thing when it was actually the other. You know, it's not that big of a deal. Doing an alternator on this is incredibly easy. It took me 30 minutes to have the old one out and the new one in. 85 bucks from the parts store. Some people argue whether to replace the alternator's brushes on a factory Toyota alternator. You can actually take apart the alternator and replace the brushes. I did not, but I'm not saying that that's not the right answer either. I think either one's fine. But I'm going to show you. Let me just pop this hood real quick. So let's start with alternator. Here's the alternator. Now, I essentially replaced this because I thought that was the issue, and in reality it wasn't. I assumed that it was undercharging or not emitting any charge whatsoever and relying on the voltage of the batteries to keep the engine going. These are great engines, and I cannot stress how bulletproof they are, but they do need voltage in order to run. If you have dead batteries and no voltage output, it will not run. Funny fact about this, though, is that given the fact that the issue that I had, it was actually an overcharging issue, I was burning some wires up, and I'm like, I'm not going to fry any more stuff. I smelt smoking on this side, and in fact, this fuse was completely melted and smoking, and from a electrical fire standpoint, that's absolutely terrifying. So that was my biggest indication that it was actually overcharging, not undercharging or a draw. So it meant that the voltage regulator had failed. Well, I'm in the middle of nowhere, so I don't have any part stores to go to. I'm 250 miles from the nearest town with an auto parts store, so I had to make it work. I did no longer want to fry any more electrical stuff because everything was still working. I'd already fried one fuse and it was literally smoking. So what I did is I disconnected the alternator and ran off sole battery power. Now, I'll give this advice. If you're in the middle of nowhere and you need to get to a destination, run absolutely no electrical. No headlights, no radio, no air conditioner, nothing that pulls electrical. This will run 6 hours plus off one battery. I had one good battery on this and it ran 6 hours with the alternator disconnected. And what I mean by disconnected, I had just simply unplugged it and ran no power whatsoever. So it was running just off the battery itself. 6 hours and it was still going. There was no starting, no turning it off. I just kept it running, but it literally got us to our destination without alternator power for 6 hours. So keep that in mind if you're in the middle of nowhere and you have a voltage issue. Okay, so fresh alternator put on, very easy to do. Now, you have all these electrical connections and all this stuff. You're wondering what the heck this is. On yours, look for a box tucked up right underneath here. This is your voltage regulator, and it's a simple plug-in right here. Simple as that. You can test this to see if it's working or not by getting a new one. They're $50 from the auto parts store. You can disconnect this as well as, you know, putting a fresh alternator. So there's only two things that really fail on these as far as if you get that voltage indication light: your alternator or your voltage regulator. An alternator is $85. You will hear people argue, like I said, to replace the brushes on the old one. You can get a remanufacture kit for apparently $15 and rebuild the old one. I just put a new one in, and we'll see how reliable that is. And then I put a new voltage regulator. That solved my issue. Charge light, all that shut off, and it's a happy camper again. So if you're wondering, as far as, you know, replace any of this stuff, your connection in the back right here, I don't know if this video can actually pull any of this up, but you have a connector right back here, and that simply is the connector to the alternator itself. So hopefully that gives you some insight on your charging system on these. The charge light comes on for a reason, and that, like I said, it means that you're either overcharging or undercharging. For me, it was overcharging, and it was a fire hazard. Do not continue driving if that light comes on, or if you do, disconnect your alternator so it's no longer putting more voltage than what the system can handle. And like I said, it'll run, key points, it'll run 5-6 hours plus without any electrical pull. This motor, if you're in the middle of nowhere, disconnect your alternator to make sure you're not overcharging. And the voltage regulator and the alternator are the only two things that you need to really be concerned about when it comes to the charging system. You can have a fuse failure, and you can go through the fuse systems on there, such as this right here. But the only other thing I would say, if you have a 22RE with the fuel injection and power steering, you're going to have to take the coolant hose off in order to get the alternator out and around the power steering. For me, I don't have that issue, so the alternator came right on out. But yeah, hopefully I give you some insight on your electrical system and charging system as far as a 22R and the 22RE. So more videos to come on this guy. Thanks for watching, and hit that subscribe button.